In the quiet of an ordinary evening, what was supposed to be a simple dinner turned into the beginning of a transformation neither of them saw coming. One unexpected proposal, an open marriage, shattered the illusion of stability they had built over the years. The idea seemed absurd at first, a distant fantasy, yet when the words were spoken with such certainty, it left him spiraling. What if this wasn't just a whim? What if their carefully constructed life was already more fragile than he realized? Torn between his own desires and the fear of losing everything, he reluctantly agreed. But each day that followed began to erode the very foundation of their relationship. As she embraced new freedoms, he found himself confronting the most painful question of all. Could they survive the fallout, or was this the end of everything they had known? Hello, my friend. I'm so glad you stopped by my channel. If you're here for the first time, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends or family. It really helps my channel a lot. Please tell me in which city or country you watched this video. I value every one of your comments. So let's get started. Dinner ran late that night. We didn't have anything fancy, just warmed up leftovers from the night before. She chose the seat opposite mine at the kitchen table, her face set in a way I couldn't quite place. For a brief second, I assumed she wanted to revisit the topic of the loan I'd promised for her business, maybe to clarify some final details. My mind was already racing ahead, caught up in figures, timelines, and repayment schedules. I never suspected that the real conversation would be something entirely different. Breaking the quiet, she finally spoke. Can we talk? This matters. I placed my fork down, giving her my full attention, a sinking feeling beginning to form. Her reluctance to meet my eyes triggered a sense of dread, as if I already knew whatever was coming would shake up everything I thought was stable. Without much preamble, she finally dropped the real subject. She wanted us to consider making our marriage open. My first reaction was laughter, not out of amusement, but disbelief. I honestly thought she was joking and waited for her to smile or say she was kidding. But her face remained serious. She held my gaze, anxiety and determination flickering in her expression. I asked her to repeat herself, desperately hoping I'd heard wrong. But she said it again, unmistakably and with conviction. She wanted us to explore an open relationship. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I must have double-checked with her more than once to be sure, and every time she affirmed she meant it. She explained she'd mulled over the idea for some time. It wasn't that our marriage was failing, she said, just that things had grown a bit too monotonous, like eating the same meal day after day. It was satisfying, but sometimes people crave something new. That metaphor stuck with me, mostly because it made everything sound so simple, like she was merely suggesting a new dinner recipe, not a fundamental change to our marriage. I asked if this was her way of giving me an ultimatum. She denied it, but her eyes said otherwise. I tried to keep my composure, though my thoughts were in complete disarray. Was I no longer enough for her? Had I overlooked warning signs? I mentally replayed our recent moments together, each embrace and every shared joke, questioning if any of it had held true meaning for her. When I finally managed to ask why she was raising this now, she assured me it wasn't because of anything I'd done wrong, but because she longed for new experiences. She confessed that some of her co-workers at the salon had talked about their own open relationships, and ever since, the thought had lingered with her. That admission stung. The realization that this wasn't a deeply personal epiphany, but something borrowed from casual workplace conversation. I wanted to be angry, but mostly I just felt adrift. She told me she wasn't asking for more freedom only for herself. She'd be comfortable with me seeing other people too, as if that would somehow balance things. I asked her what would happen if I said no. She hesitated before finally saying, "Then I won't be happy." That was what broke me. It wasn't just the words, but the way she delivered them, like her contentment now rested entirely on my willingness to overturn the foundation we'd built. I didn't respond that evening. I told her I needed time to process everything, and she agreed. Yet afterward, she was almost serene, detached, as though she already believed the outcome was certain, that I'd inevitably say yes. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying our exchange over and over. No matter how I tried to rationalize it, one thought persisted. There was no undoing this choice. Crossing that line meant nothing would be the same again. Still, some small part of me wondered, what if she was right? What if this really was the change we needed? That uncertainty was more haunting than anything else. When morning came, I half hoped the whole thing had been a nightmare. But it wasn't. She behaved as though everything was perfectly normal, making coffee, browsing her phone, as if our relationship hadn't been completely upended. I couldn't decide if her calm made things easier or harder. A part of me wanted her to be as shaken as I was, but she seemed completely unaffected. I moved through my workday in a daze, pretending to focus while my mind kept returning to our conversation. I wanted to believe we could work it out, that she might realize how deeply this hurt, or that I could persuade her to reconsider for the sake of what we had. But each time I remembered her saying, "Then I won't be happy," it felt as though the decision had already been made. When I got home, she was waiting for me, not confrontational, but clearly expecting an answer. I wasn't ready to give one. I stalled, asking more questions, trying to grasp what she was hoping to solve, if she might possibly change her mind. She wouldn't budge. She explained she'd already thought through the rules that would keep everything manageable. No bringing partners home, no involvement with mutual friends, and no sharing details unless we both agreed. It was clear she'd been considering this much longer than I'd realized. I asked her if there was someone she was already interested in. That question struck a nerve. She insisted there wasn't, but the defensiveness in her reaction made it hard to trust her answer. And at that moment, I finally understood just how little control I actually had. She had set everything in motion, and I was only just catching up. The worst part was, I said yes, even though every instinct told me to refuse. Inside, I was desperate to say no, but the fear of losing her completely paralyzed me. After sharing more than 10 years together, I couldn't bear the idea of it all ending. So I went along with it, not out of desire, but out of fear for what might happen if I didn't. As soon as I relented, I could see the relief wash over her. That hurt more than anything, the way she beamed at me, as though I'd done her a favor. I wanted to scream, to somehow make her understand the agony she'd put me through. Instead, I bit back my words and nodded, letting her embrace me as though everything was fine. In the days that followed, I forced myself to pretend as if nothing in our lives had shifted. I kept telling myself this wouldn't be permanent, that her curiosity would run its course and she'd return to me. Part of me hoped that by playing along, I could show her how much I cared, enough that she might realize she didn't want anyone else. But it didn't feel like love. It felt like survival. I was barely keeping afloat, desperate for some sort of clarity before things fell apart completely. As time went on, resentment started to fester, not only toward her, but also toward myself. I hated how easily I'd let her lead me into this situation. I couldn't stand watching her thrive with new experiences while I felt frozen with anxiety. The worst part was the persistent question echoing in my mind. What if, against all odds, I found myself enjoying it too? I tried to shut that thought down, but it always managed to surface again. Even though the idea of sharing her filled me with disgust, a tiny part of me wondered what it would feel like to finally let go, to stop obsessing over her happiness and start thinking about my own needs. Of course, I never voiced any of this to her. Instead, I kept my feelings hidden, playing the role expected of me and hoping I'd find answers before everything unraveled. But somewhere deep inside, I already sensed that we'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The first weeks slipped by in a blur. I went through the motions, pretending things were normal when they clearly weren't. Meanwhile, she seemed to light up, like she'd rediscovered a part of herself she'd long forgotten. She began spending more time out, dressing up in ways she hadn't in years. I tried at first to ignore it, but it was impossible not to see the renewed attention she was giving to her looks, effort she hadn't shown for me in ages. I tried to bury myself in work, but anxiety gnawed at me constantly. Every time she walked out the door, I wondered where she was going, who she'd be with, what was happening. I despised how obsessive I'd become, but I couldn't help it. Each night she was out, it felt like I was losing a piece of her. Then, something shifted. One night, after a particularly exhausting day, I stayed late at the office to finish up some grading. An acquaintance from another department, a familiar face but never more than that, dropped in. We ended up talking for hours about everything from academic research to future plans. It was purely friendly, nothing suggestive or inappropriate. That night, as I walked out of the building, I realized a burden had lifted from my shoulders. That sense of relief lingered. Over the following days, I started reaching out more, making genuine efforts to connect with people I usually just passed by. I wasn't looking to retaliate or prove a point. I just desperately needed something to stabilize me, something to stop the spiral I was trapped in. And to my surprise, it actually helped. What started as casual chats evolved into after-work drinks. Those outings soon led to invitations to events and gatherings. Before long, I found myself surrounded by a new group of friends, people who saw me as an individual, not just as someone's partner. My confidence grew almost overnight. I stopped sitting at home, waiting for my wife's return. Suddenly, I had my own plans, my own circle, and, if I'm honest, possibilities I'd never allowed myself to consider before. She noticed. At first, she seemed happy for me, asking about my new activities and the people I was meeting, but that soon changed. The more I embraced my new life, the more unsettled she seemed. Everything shifted when I received an invitation to a conference. The conference was out of town, and a female colleague I'd grown close to, strictly on a professional level, invited me to attend, as she would be presenting there. I accepted. The look on my wife's face when I told her is something I'll never forget. She didn't say a word, but the silence that settled between us spoke volumes. For the first time, she saw me as someone who no longer needed her approval. The conference proved to be a turning point. I built relationships that were valuable for my career and experienced, for the first time in years, what it felt like to be appreciated for who I was, not just for my role at home. When I returned, I could sense something had shifted in her too. She didn't ask about the conference itself, only about the people I'd met, particularly the colleague who had invited me. I told her the truth, but the unease was obvious. From that point on, it felt like our roles had reversed. She started questioning my schedule, curious and sometimes even suspicious about where I was and who I was with. The confidence she'd shown at the start of this whole arrangement was gone, replaced by a vulnerability I'd never seen before. I have to admit, for a short while, I enjoyed seeing her experience the uncertainty I'd lived with for so long. But that feeling didn't last. Even as I built a better, more independent version of myself, I could see the distance between us growing. I tried to convince myself it was just a rough patch, something we'd get through together, but deep down I was starting to realize that I no longer wanted to return to the way things had been. She began keeping closer tabs on me, asking about my plans, my whereabouts, the people I spent time with. She tried to act casual, as if we were just chatting, but it was obvious she was fishing for information. Initially, I didn't think much of it. After all, this whole setup had been her idea. Maybe she simply needed time to adjust to seeing me genuinely happy for once. But as our conversations continued, her questions became sharper, more deliberate. She pressed for details, who I hung out with, how I met them, what we talked about. This wasn't mere interest. Her anxiety was starting to show, and I noticed it every time we spoke. One night, I arrived home later than usual, having had a couple of drinks with colleagues, one of whom happened to be a woman I'd recently gotten to know at a conference. Nothing inappropriate occurred, but that wasn't how my wife interpreted things. When I walked in, she was on the couch, arms crossed, eyes locked onto me the second I entered. "Who were you out with?" she demanded. I answered her. I kept my response brief. Just co-workers, just drinks, nothing special. That didn't satisfy her. She wanted to know more. Who sat next to me? How late did I stay? Did I end up talking to any women? I stayed calm, but made it clear I wasn't going to submit to an interrogation. She took offense. "I thought we promised to be honest with each other," she shot back. I reminded her that being truthful wasn't the same as monitoring every move the other person made. Wasn't the whole point of this open marriage idea supposed to be about freedom, about letting go of restrictions? She didn't respond. Instead, she just looked at me, close to tears, before saying, "I don't think I want to do this anymore." I let out a laugh, not because I found it amusing, but because I'd seen this coming for some time. Naturally, she didn't want to keep going now. Not when I was the one who seemed to be thriving, while she stayed home, wondering what I was doing. But I didn't voice that. Instead, I asked her why. She confessed it wasn't working out the way she'd imagined. She missed the way we used to be, hated the growing gap between us. She admitted she'd hoped that opening our relationship would rekindle something between us, that it might add excitement and fix what was missing. I sat and listened as she let everything out, how afraid she was of losing me, how she regretted ever suggesting this path in the first place. The only thing running through my mind was how quickly she wanted to change the rules once things stopped working in her favor. I asked her whether this was really about our relationship, or if it just bothered her to see me happy on my own. That hit a sore spot. She fired back, accusing me of selfishness, of using this new arrangement to boost my ego instead of repairing what we'd lost. She said I was coming home late on purpose, paying more attention to my appearance, acting as if I thought I was better than her. That accusation stung, not because it was true, but because it made me realize how far apart we'd become. She didn't view me as her partner anymore. Instead, I felt like she saw me as a rival. I told her I'd consider closing the marriage, but inside, I already knew my answer. I wasn't ready to give up the new life I was starting to build outside of our relationship. The truth was, I wasn't sure I even wanted to repair things anymore. I think she could tell, because she started crying. Real, heartbreaking tears that make you feel like the villain, no matter how justified you feel. It hurt to see her so upset, but I couldn't shake the thought that her tears were only coming, now that things weren't going the way she wanted. I didn't have the energy for another argument, so I told her we could talk more in the morning. But as I lay in bed, listening to her try to muffle her sobs, it hit me. Whatever we once had was already gone, and nothing she said could bring it back. The next morning, something between us had changed. We barely spoke as we got ready, and I didn't push it. Honestly, I was relieved by the silence. Even at work, though, I couldn't escape the feeling that we were on the brink of something final. It was as if we were both waiting for the last push to send everything tumbling. That push arrived about a week later. By then, I'd discreetly started looking into divorce lawyers just to understand my options. I hadn't made up my mind to end things, but I needed to be prepared. Meanwhile, she was trying to act as if everything was fine. She made dinner more often, left notes in my lunch, even suggested we take a weekend trip together. But everything felt forced, and I think that's why none of it made a difference. I couldn't erase what had already taken place. I couldn't forget the nights she went out while I stayed home, feeling left behind. And I definitely couldn't overlook how anxious she became the moment I began to enjoy my own life. The final straw came when she brought up closing the marriage once more. This time, she wasn't just asking, she was begging. She told me she couldn't go on like this, that she wanted things to go back to how they used to be. I told her no. I didn't yell. I wasn't angry. I just said no, and watched as she completely fell apart. She accused me of dragging things out just to hurt her, certain that I was going out of my way to cause her pain. I tried to make her see that wasn't my intention. I wasn't seeking revenge. Honestly, I had simply lost faith that anything between us could truly be mended. That evening, she left in a fury, slamming the door as she went. Once I was alone, I started making calls. Within a few days, I'd secured an attorney and initiated the process to formally end things. Delivering the divorce papers to her was one of the hardest moments of my life. No matter what had gone on, she never anticipated it would come to this. She thought we were still working to fix our relationship, so when I handed her the envelope, she just stared at it in shock, unable to accept that it was real. Then her composure crumbled. I left the house, knowing my presence would only make things worse, but it was too late for anything to change. When I returned, chaos greeted me. Plates had been shattered, important documents were ripped apart, and a few of my watches had been destroyed. She had even taken a knife to one of my favorite pairs of dress shoes. Before touching anything, I carefully documented the scene, snapping photos and recording videos as evidence, then reached out to my lawyer. He told me to keep calm and let him handle the fallout, but that was easier said than done. She refused to leave the house, so I packed up a few necessities and moved in with a friend for the time being, hoping things would eventually calm down. I couldn't stop dwelling on what had been wrecked, not just my possessions, but everything we'd built together. By the time we were in court, whatever guilt I'd felt had faded away. In front of the judge, she tried to paint herself as the victim, accusing me of shutting her out emotionally and insisting I'd used our open marriage to degrade her. She even alleged abuse, but when pressed for evidence, photos, documentation, anything, she came up empty-handed. My lawyer picked apart her claims methodically, presenting texts that proved I never wanted an open relationship, but had gone along with it for her sake. He presented evidence of the damage she had done and reminded the court of the financial support I had consistently provided for her business. By the time the proceedings ended, she seemed utterly defeated, as though she already knew she'd lost. The verdict went in my favor. I kept the house. She was held liable for the damages and there was no alimony. Even my legal fees were covered. Stepping out of the courthouse, I felt oddly detached. A burden I hadn't realized I'd been carrying had lifted. Yet, despite everything, I couldn't help but feel a faint sadness. Not because I missed her, but because it was painfully clear that what we had was truly gone. That understanding hit me harder than I'd expected. Leaving the courthouse felt like closing one chapter and stepping into an entirely new life. What surprised me most was the calm. No anger, no bitterness, just a profound sense of relief, as if I was finally able to breathe after years of suffocating. Later that day, I returned to the house alone. She had already moved out, making things simpler, but it was strange to enter what used to be our shared home and realize it was now mine alone. Her things were gone, but traces of her lingered, the faint scent of her perfume, photographs still on the wall, little notes left on the fridge. I expected the house to feel desolate, but instead, it felt lighter. The first thing I did was remove the pictures. It wasn't out of resentment. I just didn't need them anymore. Then I started cleaning up the mess she'd left. I wanted the space to represent a new beginning, not serve as a shrine to what had fallen apart. I hadn't realized how much I'd been weighed down until that weight finally vanished. For the first time in ages, I wasn't obsessed with fixing things, making her happy, or holding our lives together. I finally had room to focus on myself, and I did. I poured myself into work. I began seeking out new collaborations, broadening my connections, and pursuing opportunities I'd previously set aside for her needs or ambitions. I started attending more conferences, met new people, and built relationships that felt genuine rather than just obligatory. To my surprise, my social circle actually grew. The friendships I'd developed during the open marriage phase didn't fade away. If anything, those connections only became stronger. They weren't just ways to fill the emptiness. They turned into true, enduring friendships. I didn't jump into dating right away, even though I easily could have. I wasn't in any rush. I needed time to rediscover myself outside the context of that marriage before inviting anyone else into my life. That didn't stop her from reaching out now and then. Occasionally, she'd text me, usually under the pretense of sorting out some practical detail, but it always veered into nostalgia or subtle questions about my life. It was clear she hoped for something more, but I kept my distance. The last time we spoke, she admitted she regretted everything. She told me she despised what she'd become and confessed that she still loved me. I didn't know what to say, so I kept things polite and brief. I wasn't angry anymore, but I had no interest in reviving any hope between us. Looking back, it's startling how much life can change in a single year. 12 months ago, I was wearing myself out, trying to rescue a marriage that was beyond saving. Now, I finally feel in control of my own life. I won't pretend the transition was flawless. There are still moments when I reflect on our time together and wonder if things could have gone another way. But then, I remember all the effort I poured in and how little came back in return. I harbor no remorse over my departure. In fact, if I feel any regret at all, it's only that I didn't choose to walk away sooner. The truth is, it wasn't the open marriage that caused our separation. It merely exposed the gap that had already formed between us. We had become strangers living under the same roof, unwilling to acknowledge how far apart we'd grown. When it comes to what lies ahead for her, it's not something I dwell on or let occupy my thoughts. What's truly important is that I've finally reached a place in my life where I don't have to explain myself or give up who I am just to satisfy someone else's expectations. That sense of autonomy is something I intend to hold on to, now and always. This story has come to an end. What's your opinion? Share it in the comments, my friend. And if you liked this story, check out other exciting videos on my channel. I'll say goodbye until the next video. See you.